Florence smelled like sun-warmed stone and secrets. That was the first thing Ella Donovan noticed when she stepped off the train at Santa Maria Novella Station with two overstuffed duffel bags, a battered portfolio case, and a map she had already folded inside out 3 times. She stood on the platform while the August crowd swirled around her, businessmen snapping phone calls in rapid Italian, a group of Japanese tourists following a raised pink umbrella, a pair of nuns gliding past like pale ships, and she breathed it all in. The heat, the noise, the thick, ancient air that pressed against her lungs and told her, unmistakably, that she was not in Ohio anymore. She was 23 years old, freshly graduated from the Ohio State University with a Bachelor of Architecture, and she had won, against odds she still did not fully understand, a 12-month fellowship at the prestigious Scuola di Architettura Europea, a postgraduate program that accepted exactly 8 international students per year. The acceptance letter had arrived on a Tuesday in March. She had read it 4 times before calling her mother, who had cried so loudly that Ella had to hold the phone away from her ear. Her mother still cried when she thought about it. But that was 3 months ago, and now Ella was here, hauling her entire life in 2 bags through a city older than her nation, trying to remember whether her apartment was on the left or right bank of the Arno. She found it eventually, a 3rd-floor walk-up on Via dei Serragli, across the river in the Oltrarno district, a neighborhood of artisan workshops, family trattoria, and cobblestones worn smooth by 500 years of footsteps. The apartment was small and the windows were tall, and the afternoon light that fell through the shutters turned everything gold. Ella dropped her bags, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and felt, for the first time in weeks, like she might be all right. She gave herself that one afternoon of stillness. Then she went out to find a grocery store. The Mercato di Santo Spirito was 2 blocks away, a covered market that sold local produce in the mornings and transformed into a lively piazza by evening. Ella moved between the stalls with a wire basket, picking up tomatoes, a wedge of pecorino, a bottle of olive oil so green it looked like liquid emerald. Her Italian was functional. She had studied it for a year before coming, watching Italian films with subtitles and repeating phrases to her reflection in the bathroom mirror, but it collapsed almost immediately under the speed of actual conversation. The woman selling herbs spoke so fast that Ella simply smiled and nodded and ended up with a bunch of rosemary she had not intended to buy. She didn't mind. The rosemary smelled like something she wanted to remember. It was on her way home, basket balanced on one arm, portfolio case on the other, that she first became aware of the black car. It was parked on the corner of Via Maggio, a long, silent Maserati with tinted windows, and it was there when she walked past it, and still there when she glanced back from the end of the block. She told herself it meant nothing. Rich people parked their expensive cars in inconvenient places all over the world. She walked home and made herself a simple dinner and sketched a detail from the Ponte Vecchio she had glimpsed from a bridge, and she did not think about the car again. Not that night, anyway. The Scuola di Architettura Europea occupied the upper floors of a 16th-century palazzo near the Piazza della Repubblica, its classrooms looking out over terracotta rooftops toward the Duomo. On her first morning, Ella arrived 9 minutes early. She was always early, a habit her mother called anxious and her professors called professional, and found she was the second student there. The first was a tall German man named Tobias who was already arranging his drafting tools in a color-coded row. They shook hands. He was pleasant and precise, and Ella liked him immediately in the uncomplicated way you like someone who poses no mystery. There were 8 of them in total. Tobias from Munich, a Korean woman named Jiun who moved with the contained energy of someone who slept exactly 5 hours a night and thrived on it. A Brazilian man named Raphael who drew with extraordinary speed. A Scottish woman named Fiona who had opinions about everything and stated them without apology, and 3 others, a quiet Frenchman, a loud Spaniard, and an Egyptian woman who wore her hair in a crown of braids and designed structures that looked like they belonged in the next century. Ella was the only American. Their professor, a weathered Florentine named Professor Cassini, welcomed them with a speech that was equal parts poetry and warning. "Florence is your classroom," he told them, his English carrying the music of Italian underneath it. "Everything you see here has been built, torn down, rebuilt, argued over, and survived. Every stone has a lesson. Your job is to learn to listen to stone." Ella wrote that down in the margins of her notebook. For the first 3 weeks, she listened to nothing but stone. She sketched the baptistry's bronze doors. She measured the proportions of Brunelleschi's dome with her eyes, the way her professors had taught her, feeling the geometry of it settle in her chest like something she had always known. She wandered the Boboli gardens at dusk and drew the patterns of hedge and shadow and light. She fell, quietly and completely, in love with this city. She did not notice, in those first weeks, that she was being watched. His name was Luca Ferrante. He was 34 years old, and in Florence, in certain rooms, on certain streets, among certain men who spoke in low voices and kept their hands still, his name was spoken with a care that bordered on reverence. He had inherited the Ferrante organization at 28, when his father, Aldo Ferrante, collapsed at the dinner table during a Sunday meal. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. In the rooms where such things were discussed, no one asked too many questions. Aldo Ferrante had been a man of iron and shadow, who had built his empire from the rubble of the 1990s, when the old Sicilian structures had fractured and the northern operations had scrambled to reorganize. He had been brilliant and ruthless and entirely without sentiment, and he had raised his son accordingly. Or tried to. Luca had the Ferrante face, sharp jaw, dark eyes, a particular quality of stillness that his father had cultivated in him from childhood. A man who cannot be read cannot be beaten, Aldo had told him, and Luca had practiced stillness the way other boys practiced football. He had it down so well now that people sometimes forgot he was in the room, and then felt a cold shock when they turned and found him watching. But there were things his father had not managed to build out of him. A certain attention to beauty, an instinct for when a thing was wrong, not strategically wrong, wrong in the older sense, the kind that kept you awake, and a habit, impossible to explain, of noticing people on the margins of things, the ones who didn't quite fit, the ones who carried their strangeness the way tourists carried maps, openly, without apology. He noticed the American girl on a Tuesday morning in September. He had been in the Altrarno for a meeting, one of many, with men who presented themselves as property developers and were, in fact, exactly that, provided you accepted that the properties in question were sometimes used to store things that could not be itemized on a balance sheet. The meeting had gone smoothly. His associate Marco had driven him back along Via Maggio, and they had paused at the corner while a small procession of tourists crossed in front of the car, and that was when Luca had seen her. She was carrying an enormous portfolio case and a wire basket of groceries, and she was walking with a particular kind of purposefulness that suggested she was not entirely sure where she was going, but intended to arrive there with conviction. Her hair was light brown, the color of creek water in autumn, and it was falling out of whatever she had tried to pin it into, and she didn't seem to notice or care. She looked up at the buildings as she walked, not with the passive glance of a tourist, but with something more active, more hungry, as though she were trying to pull the architecture into herself through her eyes. "Who is she?" he said. Not to anyone in particular. Marco glanced in the rearview mirror. "Don't know. Tourist, probably." "No." Luca watched her turn the corner. "Not a tourist." He put her out of his mind. He had other things to attend to. The situation in Bologna was becoming complicated, and the new customs arrangements at the Genoa port required his personal oversight, and his sister Elena had called 3 times in the past week about their mother's health, and all of this had nothing to do with a girl with a portfolio case and groceries. He saw her again on Thursday. This time she was sitting on the steps of a church, Santa Felicita, he thought, the small one near the Ponte Vecchio, with a sketchbook open on her knees and her tongue caught between her teeth, and a look of total absorption on her face that made her oblivious to everything around her, including the pigeon that had settled 6 inches from her left foot and was regarding her with philosophical patience. She was drawing something on the facade above the door, some detail He couldn't identify from where he stood, and her hand moved across the paper with a confidence that was at odds with the lost in translation quality she'd had on Tuesday. She was different when she was working. He could see that from the street. He walked on. He did not stop. He told himself he was simply observing, the way he always observed, the way his father had taught him to know his environment completely. It was professional habit. It was nothing. But he asked Marco to find out who she was. Marco brought him the information the following morning. Ella Donovan, 23, American, from a small city in Ohio. Student at the Scuola di Architettura Europea on a fellowship. Living on Via dei Serragli, 3rd floor, above an umbrella shop. No family in Italy. No significant ties. No connection, as far as anyone could determine, to any person or organization that should concern the Ferrante family. Luca read the report twice and set it aside. She's just a student, Marco said. Yes, Luca agreed. He filed the report in a drawer and turned his attention to Bologna, which was considerably more urgent and considerably less difficult to explain. It happened on a Friday. Ella had been out late with Gian and Fiona, the three of them having discovered a wine bar near the Piazza Santo Spirito that poured generous Chianti and had a ceiling painted with gold stars. They had stayed until nearly midnight, talking about architecture and about home, and about the particular loneliness of being 23 in a foreign city, how it was a loneliness that was also something else, something adjacent to freedom, not quite the same as either. She walked home alone. It was 12 blocks, 10 minutes, and she had done it a dozen times. The Altrarno at night was quiet, the streets narrow, the occasional street lamp throwing amber circles on the cobblestones. She liked walking in the dark here. Florence was a city that wore its history differently at night. All the tourist noise stripped away, the stones themselves more visible. She turned onto Via Sant'Agostino and became aware of the footsteps. 2 sets. Behind her, to her left. She didn't turn immediately. She was the kind of woman who had been taught not to be paranoid, who had internalized the idea that fear was something to be managed rather than trusted. But the footsteps matched her pace when she slowed. And when she stopped to pretend to check her phone, they stopped too. She turned then. 2 men, both in their 30s, one heavy-set in a pale jacket, one thinner with a close-cropped beard. They were not trying to pretend they were anything other than what they were. That was what frightened her most, that they weren't even bothering. "Signorina," said the heavy one. His Italian was accented, not Florentine. She didn't know enough to place it. "You should not be walking alone." Her Italian failed her completely. I'm fine," she said, in English, backing up. They exchanged a look. The thin one moved to the left, angling her toward the wall. And then there was a sound. A car door, close, then footsteps of a different quality, certain and unhurried, and a voice she had never heard before, speaking Italian in a tone that was the auditory equivalent of a hand gripping iron. "Andate via. Go away." She turned. A man stood at the edge of the lamplight, hands in the pockets of a dark overcoat, watching the 2 men with an expression of absolute calm. He was tall, with the kind of face that looked like it had been cut rather than formed, defined, angular, still. He was not looking at her. He was looking at them, and the look was enough. The 2 men left. That was all. No argument, no escalation. They simply left, turning back the way they had come, moving quickly, the pale jacket disappearing around the corner. The man turned to her then. His eyes were dark, the color of deep water, and the lamplight made them unreadable. She felt, obscurely, that this was someone who was not in the habit of being readable. "Are you hurt?" His English was precise, with an Italian shape underneath the consonants. She shook her head. Her heart was still hammering. "Who were those people?" "Men who make poor decisions," he said. "Where are you going?" She told him her street. He nodded, and without asking, turned in that direction. "You don't have to," she began. "I know," he said. He walked her home. 10 blocks, 10 minutes, in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She didn't understand why, since he was a stranger and she was still trembling slightly, and none of this was a situation she could explain. But there was something in the way he moved, a quality of absolute steadiness, that made the air around him feel safer than the air around everything else. At her door, she turned to thank him and got her first real look at him in the light that fell from the vestibule. 30s, dark-suited, a face that had composed itself into something careful and contained. He was, she thought, the most controlled person she had ever seen, and the most immediately, uncomfortably present. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Ella." A pause, brief, during which she had the impression of a choice being made. "Luca," he said. He did not offer his last name. She would find out why later, much later, when it was already too late to be surprised. "Thank you, Luca," she said. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back up the street, unhurried, and the dark closed around him like it knew him, like they had an arrangement. She stood in her doorway for a long moment after he was gone. Then she went inside, locked the door, sat on her bed, and breathed. She did not sleep well, but when she did sleep, she dreamed about geometry, the clean, inevitable geometry of an arch, the way a well-designed vault distributes weight, the way a structure holds itself up by understanding its own nature. She decided this was her mind processing architecture. She was a student, after all. She did not think about Luca Ferrante. Not all night, anyway. Luca knew who those men were. Their names were Costello and Draculae, two mid-level operators connected to the Russo outfit in Naples, which had been making careful and increasingly irritating incursions into Florentine territory for the better part of 6 months. They were here in a capacity that was nominally about a property negotiation. There was always a property negotiation. It was the fig leaf everyone used. But Luca had known for 3 weeks that the property negotiation was a pretext, that the Russo organization was mapping his streets, identifying his associates, and testing the edges of his patience. He had not expected them to test those edges on an American architecture student. Why was she targeted? He asked Marco the next morning, sitting in the ground floor office of the Palazzo Ferrante, which occupied a building on Via Tornabuoni and presented to the world the entirely convincing face of a private investment firm. Marco was quiet for a moment. "We're not sure she was. She may have been in the wrong place. Or," he paused, "someone may have known you were watching her." That was the possibility that concerned him. The idea that the Russo men had identified his interest in the girl and decided to use her as leverage, or as a message. It was an old tactic, ancient as war. You threaten the thing a man has shown a weakness for, and you see what he does. But he had shown no weakness. He had asked one question and received one report, and put the report in a drawer. That was not a weakness. That was professional thoroughness. "Make sure she's covered," he said. Quietly. "She doesn't need to know." Marco nodded. He had been Luca's right hand for 8 years, long enough to have learned the precise value of not asking why. Luca put the matter of Ella Donovan in a separate compartment of his mind, the one he reserved for things that required monitoring, and turned his attention back to the Russo situation, which was going to require a response that was measured, decisive, and demonstrative. He had a meeting scheduled in 2 days with his counterpart in Milan, and he needed to have his position clear before then. He thought about the girl on the church steps with her sketchbook, the way her hand had moved with that unguarded confidence. He turned his attention back to the Russo situation. She was in a cafe on Via della Vigna Nuova. He knew this because Marco's man had followed her there, working at a corner table with a coffee going cold beside her and a stack of architectural books that she appeared to be reading simultaneously, opening one, making a note, opening another, cross-referencing with a third. She had a way of leaning forward when something interested her, a slight incline of her whole body toward the page, like a plant turning toward light. He was not watching her. He was reviewing a financial document in the back of his car, which happened to be parked on the same street. He told himself this 3 times, and by the 3rd time, he almost believed it. The fellowship program took its students on a series of what Professor Cassini called encounters with private patrimony, visits to historic private buildings not generally open to the public, arranged through the dense web of relationships that the scuola had cultivated over its 40-year history. It was one of the things that made the program extraordinary, Ella thought. Not just the classrooms and the lectures, but this direct access to the living, breathing architecture of a city that had been continuously inhabited for 2,000 years. The third private visit of the semester was to Palazzo Ferrante. Ella didn't know whose palazzo it was when she arrived. She knew only that it was on Via Tornabuoni, that it dated to the 15th century with significant 17th century modifications, and that they had been told, specifically, to focus on the loggia and the internal courtyard. She stood in the street outside with her sketchbook and her camera and felt the familiar catch in her chest that beautiful old buildings always produced in her. Something between desire and humility, the feeling of standing in front of something that had been doing this for centuries before you arrived and would continue for centuries after you left. Professor Cassini led them through a heavy wooden door into a vestibule, then through a second door into the courtyard, and Ella stopped walking. It was extraordinary. The courtyard was open to the sky, ringed by a double loggia, arched below, with slender columns, then a more restrained pilastered arcade above, all in pietra serena, the gray-blue Florentine stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and turned warm in the afternoon. In the center was a simple well, 16th century, and the pavement was a pattern of cream and gray stone in a geometric interlace that repeated the rhythm of the arches above. She was sketching before she was fully aware of deciding to sketch. Her hand moved across the paper, laying in the proportions of the loggia, the relationship between column width and arch span, the way the shadow played across the entablature. She was still sketching when she became aware that someone was standing very near her. She looked up. Luca Ferrante was watching her work. He was in a dark suit, no tie, jacket open, standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets. He looked completely at home in the courtyard, as though he had been standing there for a very long time, as though the courtyard itself was arranged around him rather than the other way around. Ella's pencil stopped moving. "You're the one who drew on his steps," he said. He was looking at her sketchbook. "I draw on many steps," she managed. "Santa Felicita?" "Yes." She paused. "This is your house." "My family's. Since 1587. He said it the way other people said things that were simply true, without inflection. "Since 1587, she repeated. Her own family had not owned the house she grew up in. They rented it, and the landlord raised the rent every 3 years, and her mother said things about it that Ella was not going to repeat in a 16th century courtyard. I'm sorry, I can't imagine what that's like." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but an acknowledgement. "Most people can't." She looked back at the loggia. "The capital details on the ground floor columns," she said. "They're not standard Corinthian. There's something folded into them. I can't quite." "Florentine lilies," he said. "My ancestor who built this had an obsession with the city's symbol. He put them everywhere. In the iron of the window grills. In the pavement pattern. Even in the—" He hesitated, briefly, and she had the impression he was deciding how much to say. "In the private rooms, which are not on the tour. He sounds like someone who loved this place very much. He sounds like someone who wanted to be absolutely certain everyone knew it was his." She laughed. It came out before she could stop it. A surprised, genuine laugh, and she saw something flicker in his face, that same not-quite smile from a moment ago, less controlled this time, almost involuntary. "I should let you," he began. "No. Please, I'm sorry," she said, at the same moment. They both stopped. "I didn't mean to interrupt your work," he said. "You didn't," she said. "I mean, you did, but I don't mind." She looked at her sketchbook, at the loggia she'd been drawing. "It helps, sometimes, to have someone explain a place. The history of it. The intention." She paused. "You clearly know this place very well." "I grew up here," he said. Simply. She wanted to ask what that was like, to grow up in a palace, to know since childhood that the stone around you had been standing for 5 centuries. But Professor Cassini was calling the group toward the loggia for a closer examination of the capitals. And Ella had to go, and she went, and she did not look back. But she was aware, for the rest of the visit, of exactly where in the courtyard he stood. He watched her leave with the group, her portfolio case tucked against her side, her sketchbook pressed against her chest, still open to the page with his courtyard on it. He told himself, for the fourth time in 3 weeks, that he was not getting involved. She saw him on a Sunday. This was different from the other times, from the walk home in the dark and the visit to his palazzo. This was coincidence. She was almost sure it was coincidence. At the Sunday antiques market that spread across the Piazza Santo Spirito on the last Sunday of each month, stalls of old prints and silver and furniture and ceramics and things that resisted categorization. Ella had been there for an hour, moving happily from stall to stall, when she turned and nearly walked into him. He caught her, one hand on her arm, steadying, and then let go the instant she was balanced, as though he was conscious of the gesture even in the moment of making it. "You're everywhere," she said, and immediately regretted how it sounded. "It's a small city," he said. "It's not, actually." She adjusted the old architectural print she'd been holding, a 19th-century engraving of the Ponte Vecchio, deeply inaccurate in certain proportions, which she loved for that reason. "I've been here 2 months, and this is the third time I've run into you." He looked at the print in her hands. "That bridge is wrong." "I know. The arch-to-span ratio is completely off. I like it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Around them the market moved and murmured. Pigeons landed and departed. A child ran past with a balloon. "Why?" he asked. "Because it's wrong, but it's confident," she said. "Whoever drew this really believed in their version. There's something in a line that means it." She paused, aware she was explaining herself to a stranger. "Sorry. Occupational excess." "Occupational excess," he repeated, as though testing the phrase. "What does a student have to be excessive about?" "Architecture students have strong feelings," she said. "We're very serious about right angles." That fractional not-quite smile again. She was beginning to catalog its conditions, the laugh that surprised him, the catalog of his ancestors' Florentine lilies, now this. Each time, it arrived before his control could prevent it. She didn't know why she found this interesting. She just did. They walked together for a while. It happened the way those things do, without either of them deciding, simply falling into step as they moved along the line of stalls. He stopped at one where an old man was selling maps, and examined a hand-drawn property map from the 1840s with the same quality of attention she brought to her sketching, that unhurried completeness. "Do you collect maps?" she asked. "I collect information," he said. He set the map down. She wanted to ask what that meant. She bought the Ponte Vecchio print instead, and he watched her bargain the price down. Badly, she knew, but she tried, and afterward he said, without inflecting it as criticism, "You should have offered 40, not 50. "I don't like arguing over money," she said. "You're going to have a difficult time in this country." "I've been told." They had coffee at a bar on the edge of the piazza, standing at the counter the way Italians do. She ordered badly. She always ordered badly. Something about the rapid-fire rhythm of Italian cafe service made her brain rearrange itself into confusion, and he quietly corrected the order before she could be handed the wrong thing. He did it without drawing attention to the correction, without making her feel foolish. She noticed this. It seemed important somehow, that he would do a kindness and immediately make it invisible. "What do you do?" she asked. "For work." Then she remembered. The Palazzo, the investment firm on Via Tornabuoni. "Besides does the family business." "I manage various interests," he said. It was such a perfect non-answer that she almost laughed. "Various interests," she echoed. "My uncle says that. He sells insurance. My interests are different from insurance." "Are they more interesting?" A pause. "Some of them." "Which ones?" She was pushing. She knew she was pushing. She blamed the Sunday morning, the coffee, the fact that the piazza looked like a painting in the October light. People said the light in Tuscany was extraordinary, and she had thought it was a cliché before she arrived, and now she knew it was simply true. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the feeling of something being reconsidered. "Architecture," he said finally. "I find architecture interesting. The negotiation between a builder and the laws of the physical world." "And who usually wins?" "The building," he said. "Always. Long after the builder is gone." She thought about his family's palazzo, the courtyard that had been standing since 1587, the Florentine lilies and the capitals. "Yes," she said. That's what I keep learning, I think. That's what this city is teaching me. He looked away, out across the piazza. The morning light fell across his profile and turned him, briefly, into a figure from one of the old paintings in the Uffizi. That contained, precise quality, the sense of someone who had learned that stillness was a kind of power. The city is a good teacher, he said, if you're willing to pay attention. She paid for her coffee. He paid for his. They walked back across the piazza in the comfortable silence of people who do not yet know each other, but have begun to be curious, and parted at the corner without making plans to meet again. She walked home through streets already filling with Sunday families, old men on benches, the smell of lunch being made in 100 kitchens, and she thought about a man who called his work various interests and thought buildings outlasted their builders and corrected her coffee order without making her feel small. She thought about this for longer than was strictly reasonable. October brought rain, not the dramatic storms of summer, but a steady, patient gray that settled over the city and made the stones darker and more beautiful. Ella loved it. She spent wet afternoons in churches and galleries, which she had taken to visiting not as a tourist but as a student, sitting for long periods in front of specific works with her sketchbook, not to copy them, but to understand the decisions that had made them. Why this proportion? Why this particular fall of light? Why this space feels inevitable and not arbitrary? She sent long, detailed emails to her mother about what she was learning, and her mother replied with long, detailed emails about neighborhood gossip and her garden and the 2 cats Ella had left behind, Orange and Professor. She called home every Sunday. She was, on the whole, happy in the way of someone who is doing the thing they were meant to do. She did not know about the men who followed her. They were subtle about it. They had been selected for subtlety, and they rotated so that she never saw the same face twice in close succession. A man reading a newspaper on her corner. A woman at the next table in the cafe she frequented. A car that happened to turn in the same direction but never approached. She had no reason to notice. She noticed the buildings, the light, the geometry of streets. People were largely background to her, the way music is background when you are reading. Luca knew this. It was why the arrangement worked. He had 3 men on her, rotating. Marco had objected, not to the protection itself, but to the resource allocation. It's been 6 weeks, Marco had said. The Russo men haven't come back. Whatever they were doing with her, they've moved on. Or they're waiting, Lucas said. Waiting for what? He didn't answer. He wasn't sure he had an answer, or at least not one he was prepared to examine closely. He increased the rotation to 4 men. He had her building's entry code changed and the new one given to her landlord without explanation. He did not tell her. Then, in the 2nd week of October, Marco brought him news from Naples. The Russo organization had dispatched a senior figure, a man named Emilio Costa, which was not his real name, but the one he used for business, to Florence. Costa was not a property negotiator. Costa was a fixer, the kind sent when patience had run out and the message needed to be sent in a register that was difficult to misread. What's his mandate? Luca asked. We think they want to establish a Florentine corridor. Direct access, independent of our infrastructure. Marco spread the documents across the table. They need something from us, either cooperation or collapse. Costa is here to determine which is more efficient. And the girl? Marco looked at him. We think she's incidental. The connection to you is thinner than we thought. Or they think she's not incidental. He looked at the reports. Increased to 6 men. And I want to know the moment Costa moves within 3 blocks of her. Marco said nothing for a moment. Then, boss. Yes. Is there something here I should understand? Luca looked at his associate with the flat, quiet attention that he used when a question had overstepped. There is a young woman who has no connection to any of this, who is living 3 months into a year abroad, who wants to learn architecture. The Russo organization has already frightened her once. I don't intend to allow it to happen again. And beyond that. There is no beyond that, Lucas said. There is exactly that. Marco did not look entirely convinced. But he left, and the order stood, and Ella Donovan walked through October Florence in a quiet perimeter of protection she was entirely unaware of, sketching facades and reading in cafes, and eating at the trattoria near her apartment where the owner's wife had decided she was too thin and gave her extra portions of ribollita. She was, within the considerable constraints of the world she had accidentally brushed against, safe. He came to the scuola. This was not something he had planned. He had an appointment in the Piazza della Repubblica, a meeting with his lawyer, in an office building 2 streets over, and he was early, and the scuola's palazzo was on his route, and he told himself he was simply walking. She was on the steps of the building when he arrived. She was sitting with her back against a pilaster, knees drawn up, a large textbook balanced across them, eating a piece of bread she had clearly bought from the bakery on the corner because there was a paper bag beside her and flour on her jacket. She was reading with the total absorption he had come to recognize, the forward lean, the tongue between the teeth, the complete absence of awareness of anything outside the page. He stopped. He should not stop. He had a meeting. She looked up. Perhaps she heard his footsteps stop, or perhaps she had some peripheral awareness of being observed, or perhaps it was coincidence. And her face did something complicated. Surprise, first. Then the settling of surprise into something warmer, and then a self-consciousness about the warmth, a small drawing back. "Hi," she said. "Hello." He looked at the book. It was a text on Brunelleschi. Assignment. Personal obsession. She held it up slightly, as though presenting evidence. "I keep coming back to the dome. The way he built it without a centering, without internal support while it was under construction. Everyone said it couldn't be done without traditional scaffolding, and he just..." She made a small gesture with her free hand, bread still in it. He just knew something they didn't know. He could see it complete in his mind before it existed. He sat down on the step beside her. This was also not planned. He sat, and was aware of sitting, and did not stand up. "What did he see?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment, as though checking whether the question was genuine. "It was the way the weight would distribute," she said. "The way an octagonal dome, if you build it with a herringbone brick pattern, is self-supporting at each stage of construction. The structure holds itself up as it grows. You don't need external support because you've built internal logic into the thing itself." She paused. "Which is, I think, the most beautiful engineering principle I've ever encountered." He thought about this. He thought about what it would mean to build a structure with such integrity that it needed no external support. He thought about the organization he had inherited and the way he had spent 6 years rebuilding its internal logic after his father's methods had left it dependent on fear rather than structure. He thought about this in the way he thought about most things that mattered, privately and without expressing it. "You said something like that at the market," he said, "about lines that mean it." She looked at him. "You remembered that." "I remember conversations." "That's unusual." "Is it?" She looked back at the book. "Most people remember impressions. Feelings. Not the actual words." She paused. "You remember words. I find precision useful." She laughed, not the surprised laugh from the courtyard, but a softer one, more considered. "I'm imprecise in speech and very precise in work. My professors all say this. I'll give a completely confused verbal description of something and then draw it exactly right." "Perhaps you speak in a different language," he said. She looked at him again, and this time there was something in her look that he recognized with a start of warning. A beginning of trust, the look of someone who has found a register that fits them and is inclined to keep talking. He knew what that look meant. He knew what came after it. He stood. "I have a meeting," he said. Her expression rearranged itself quickly, the openness folding back in. "Of course," she said. "Sorry to. Don't apologize." He said it more sharply than he intended. Then, more carefully, "You haven't done anything requiring apology." She looked up at him from the steps, bread in one hand, book in the other, flour on her jacket, with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. She was not a woman who would beg. He could see that, the pride in the set of her chin, the way she had already composed herself back to something pleasant and distant. He thought about leaving. He thought about his meeting, his lawyer, the documents waiting on a conference table 2 streets away. "On Thursday evenings," he said, "there is an open lecture at the Opificio del Pietre Dure, the Conservation Institute. This week they are discussing the restoration of 15th century fresco cycles. I think it would interest you. She studied him for a moment. Is that an invitation? It's information. A pause. You can do what you like with it. He walked away. He was halfway down the block before he heard her call after him. Thank you, Luca. He did not turn, but he felt the words land somewhere specific, somewhere he did not usually allow things to land. She went to the lecture. She told herself she would have gone anyway. It was exactly the kind of thing she should be attending. It was directly relevant to her studies. The Opificio del Pietradur was one of the world's premier conservation institutes, and access to their public lectures was a gift she should not waste. All of this was true, and she told herself all of it, and arrived 12 minutes early, which was 9 minutes earlier than her usual 3-minute earliness, which perhaps communicated something she was not prepared to examine. The lecture hall was in a converted workshop, high-ceilinged, with original stone floors and the particular smell of a place where conservation work happened, a faint chemical overlay on old stone, like history with a scientific subtitle. There were perhaps 40 people, mostly professionals and students, settled in rows of wooden chairs. He was already there. 4th row, aisle seat, dark jacket, eyes on the front of the room. She sat 2 seats away from him, which was not beside him, but not far either. He glanced at her, and she nodded, and they watched the lecturer arrange his materials. And then the lecture began, and for an hour and 20 minutes Ella was entirely absorbed. The lecturer, a precise, enthusiastic man named Dr. Pellegrini, was discussing the restoration of a fresco cycle in a chapel near Arezzo, specifically the challenge of stabilizing sections where the original intonaco had detached from the underlying arriccio. He showed close photographs of the painted surface, discussed the injected consolidants they were using, explained the color matching process for the sections that needed reintegration. Ella took 5 pages of notes and whispered questions to herself and forgot entirely, for long stretches, that she was not alone. Luca did not take notes. He watched the images on the screen and listened with the same quality of attention she had seen him bring to the old map at the market and to her sketchbook in the courtyard. Thorough, unhurried, comprehensive. Afterward, Dr. Pellegrini invited questions, and Ella's hand went up before she could stop it. She asked about the use of Japanese tissue in the facing process, whether the different paper weights affected the stability of the facing layer differently across sections of varying porosity. Dr. Pellegrini looked pleased. He answered at length. Several people turned to look at the woman with the American accent who was asking about tissue weights. Luca, she noticed from the corner of her eye, did not turn. He was already looking at her. They left together, another undecided together, the kind that happens because they were both moving toward the exit and the pace matched. Outside, the November air was cold and clear, the street dark between its pools of lamplight. Japanese tissue, he said. It's used in fresco conservation. I know what it is. I was there for the lecture. But his tone wasn't corrective. You asked a specialist question. I read a lot. She pulled her coat around her. I get interested in things, and then I can't stop. It's honestly a problem sometimes. I'll be researching structural systems for a project, and 3 hours later, I'm reading about Byzantine mosaic techniques. That's not a problem, he said. That's how people learn things that matter. She looked at him sidelong. In the lamplight, with the lecture behind him and the November street around them, he seemed, somehow, less composed than she'd seen him before. Not different, still utterly still that quality of controlled presence, but slightly more present in a different way, like a painting from which someone had removed a layer of varnish. What things do you learn that matter? She asked. He considered this. How people make decisions. How structures fail. The difference between a problem that can be solved and one that has to be survived. That's a dark curriculum. It's an accurate one. They walked. She did not ask where they were going, and he did not explain, and they ended up at a small osteria on a side street. The kind of place with 4 tables and a handwritten menu and a stout woman behind the bar who greeted Luca by name and looked at Ella with bright, appraising eyes. They ate ribollita, rabbit, bread, a glass of wine each, and they talked about the lecture, about Brunelleschi and his dome, about the Ohio town she had grown up in and how it had made her need large, complex, old spaces the way some people need silence. He talked about Florence with the precision of someone who had grown up knowing every stone, but had had to learn to love it on different terms than the ones his father had offered. He did not say this directly. She heard it anyway. "Do you love it?" she asked. "The city." He thought about this longer than she expected. "I love what it is," he said finally. "What it survived. What it remembers how to be." He looked at the osteria wall, where an old map of Florence was pinned. "Whether I'm capable of the right kind of love is a separate question." "What's the right kind?" "Uncomplicated," he said. "Ungoverned." She thought about that word, ungoverned. The way he said it, not with longing, exactly, but with a recognition that it described something outside his experience. Something he understood from the outside. She wanted to ask more. She didn't. Some conversations have a natural depth, and going deeper requires permissions that haven't yet been given. They walked back through the cold streets, and he left her at her door as he had the first night. And this time she said good night instead of just thank you. And he said good night and not just nodded, and it was a small difference, but she measured it. She measured it the way she measured proportions, knowing that the small differences were where all the meaning lived. November deepened. The tourists thinned. The city became more itself, or so Ella felt. Its rhythms more visible, its personalities more distinct. The way a room reveals itself when the guests have gone, and it's just the people who live there. She was walking back from the library at the university. She had spent the afternoon in the architecture collection, tracking a specific detail in a treatise on Alberti, when the man stepped out of a doorway. She didn't recognize him at first. Then she did, the pale jacket. Costello, though she didn't know his name, the heavier of the two men from that night in September. He looked different in daylight, more ordinary, which somehow made him more frightening. "Miss Donovan," he said, in English, with a heavy accent. The use of her name turned her cold. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he said, "but I know you, and I know who your friend is." He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had decided smiling was useful, but had never felt the impulse to do it naturally. "Luca Ferrante. You know what he is." Her heart was hammering. She kept her voice even. She wasn't sure how, but she managed it. "I know he's a private citizen in a country I'm visiting as a student." "He's not private." Costello stepped slightly closer. He wasn't blocking her way. It was a daylight street with people on it, 20 meters away, but the step communicated something. "He is a very, very public kind of man in certain circles. And you were sitting with him in Ostery, yes? Having dinner. Very friendly." He paused. "This interests my employer." "Your employer should mind his business," she said. She sounded braver than she felt. She felt like her legs were made of water. "This is his business," Costello said simply. "Tell your friend we want a conversation. Civil. Civil, no problems. Tell him the Russo family wishes to speak." He looked at her steadily. "If he prefers that we arrange the conversation through other means, we can do that. But it's less pleasant for everyone." He walked away. She stood on the pavement for a long moment, breathing, watching him go. And then she sat down on the nearest bench because her legs had decided they were done. She sat for 5 minutes. Then she took out her phone and stared at the contact she'd entered. Luca, just Luca, no last name, and made a decision she was already half certain she would regret. She called. He answered on the second ring. Ella. Her name in his mouth, in his voice. She registered this distantly, below the immediate urgency. "Someone spoke to me," she said. "On Via della Vigna Nuova. A man I recognized. From that first night, in September." Silence. Not an empty silence, but a full one. The silence of someone processing very quickly. "Are you hurt?" "No. He gave me a message. For you." He said his name. His employer's name is Russo, and they want a conversation. Another silence. "Where are you now?" She told him. "Stay there," he said. "I'm coming." He was there in 8 minutes, which told her something about how close he must have been, or had arranged to be. He came on foot, alone, in the dark jacket, and found her on the bench where she was holding herself very still, because if she held still enough, the shaking stayed interior. He sat beside her and looked at her face with that particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered. Tell me what he said, he said. She told him. All of it, word by word, because she had spent the waiting time fixing the conversation in her memory precisely, the way she did with anything she wanted to keep. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? I'm not all right, she said. I'm scared. I'm Luca. She stopped. Who are you? The question sat between them. He looked at the street, at the people moving past, at the approaching evening. I told you I manage various interests, he said. I know you did. What does that mean? Actually mean? He looked at her then, and the look was different from all the others she had catalogued. Not the not-quite smile, not the thorough attention, not the particular regard she had felt once or twice and half convinced herself she'd imagined. This was something else, something that had decided. My family, he said, has operated certain enterprises in this city and in this region for 60 years. The nature of those enterprises has evolved, but they remain, in ways that are difficult to explain simply, enterprises that exist outside certain official structures. You're in the Mafia, she said. He didn't flinch. The organizations your country's films refer to by that name are specifically Sicilian. What I come from is related but distinct. Florentine in origin, older in some ways. But the principle is the same. A pause. The principle is the same. Ella looked at her hands. She thought about his courtyard, the Florentine lilies and the capitals. She thought about the walk home in September and the coffee at the bar and the osteria dinner and the way he'd corrected her order without making her feel small. She thought about what her mother would say and about what she herself thought, and about the fact that she was sitting on a bench in November Florence having just been threatened by a man who wanted to use her as a message. How long have you known those men were connected to you? She said. Since the night I walked you home. That long. She absorbed this. Have you been watching me? Since then. Another pause. I've ensured your safety. Without telling me. Yes. She breathed. In and out. She thought about the architecture principle she'd been thinking about all semester, that a structure's integrity depends on understanding the forces acting upon it. You cannot design for strength if you don't understand the loads. She thought about the fact that this man, who was by his own admission something she had been taught all her life to fear, had spent 2 months making sure she was safe and had not asked anything in return and had not advertised it and had told her the truth when she asked. What are you going to do? She said. Handle the situation, he said. It will be handled. You won't be troubled again. And me? She looked at him. What happens to me in all this? He met her eyes. She had the feeling, again, of a decision being made, this time differently from all the others, more slowly, more deliberately, as though he understood the weight of it. What would you like to happen to you? He said. It was such a strange question, delivered with such careful neutrality, and yet she understood it entirely. He was giving her the choice. He was putting it in her hands, whatever this was, whatever they were, putting it where she could refuse it. She looked at him for a long time. The November evenings settled around them, pigeons and lamplight, and the distant sound of the city being itself. I'd like to understand, she said finally. I don't want to be handled. I want to understand. He nodded, slowly. That may be complicated. I know. She looked at the street. I'm good with complicated. He took her, that evening, not to an osteria or a cafe, but to the palazzo. Through the heavy wooden door, across the courtyard that she had visited with her classmates and that she now crossed differently. Not as a student examining the loggia, but as a person being led somewhere by someone who had just told her something true and enormous. And up a staircase to a room on the piano nobile that was a library, or what a library would be if a library had been lived in for 400 years. Books in floor-to-ceiling shelves, organized in some system she couldn't immediately decode. A desk with nothing on it except a single lamp. Chairs by a fireplace, which was lit, the fire already burning as though he had known they would come here, or had had someone prepare it in the 8 minutes between her phone call and his arrival, which she was beginning to realize was how his life ran. Things arranged in advance because he thought 3 steps ahead and kept resources in place. He told her what she needed to know and nothing more, which was, she was coming to understand, his characteristic measure. He explained the Ferrante organization, not its operations in detail, but its nature, its history, the way it differed from the cinematic version she had grown up understanding, the ways it did not differ. He told her about the Russo incursion, about the men in September, about the meeting that Costa was in Florence to force. He was precise and calm and entirely honest, and she thought, this is how you build trust. Not by being safe. He was not safe. She was not foolish enough to think otherwise, but by telling the truth when you could have told a comfortable lie. Why are you telling me this? She said, when he had finished. Because you asked. That's not enough. He looked at the fire. No, it isn't. He was quiet for a moment. I've been telling myself, for 2 months, that this is proximity. That I happened to encounter you and took a professional interest in ensuring your safety, because the alternative, the Russo organization using an innocent person as leverage, was unacceptable. And all of that is true. But, she said, but I have come to the scuola to walk past. I have gone to a market on a Sunday morning when I had no reason to be in that piazza. I mentioned a lecture that I had no reason to mention, and then I attended it. He looked at her. I am not given to self-deception. I know what these things mean. She held very still. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the palazzo a clock was ticking. What do they mean? She said. That I find you. He paused, with the care of someone choosing a word that is exactly right rather than approximately right. Remarkable. And that I have been reluctant to acknowledge this because the reasonable thing, given the circumstances, is distance. Is this distance? She said. No, he said. It isn't. She looked at her hands. She looked at the fire. She thought about what reasonable meant when you were 23 years old in Florence and a man with a courtyard full of Florentine lilies had just told you, in the most restrained and precise language she had ever heard, that he found her remarkable. I'm scared, she said, of what you've told me about your world. I should be clear about that. Yes, he said. That's rational. But I'm also, she stopped. Yes, he said. He had heard the word she didn't say, the way he always heard the thing beneath the thing. This is, she said carefully, going to be extraordinarily complicated. Yes. I'm still in it, she said. Whatever it is. I'm still yes. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she hadn't seen before on his face, something unguarded, something that required no decoding because it was simply there, simple and clear and enormous. All right, he said. The fire burned. The clock ticked. Florence existed around them, old and indifferent and magnificent. Loving Luca Ferrante was, Ella found, like learning to read a language that used no alphabet she recognized. The words were there. She could see them. But the system was different. The grammar was different. The way meaning accumulated was not linear but structural. The way a building communicates not through sentences, but through proportion and weight and the decisions invisible within the visible form. He did not say, I am worried about you. He said, it is cold tonight, and the walk from the scuola to your apartment has 3 badly lit sections on Via San Agostino. And then he appeared at the scuola at the end of her late class with the car and Marco at the wheel, and he never explained this. He did not say, I want to understand what you love. He said, tell me about the Alberti treatise you were working through last week. And then he listened for 45 minutes without checking his phone, asking questions at the precise moments when her answer wanted a question. He did not say, I'm glad you're in my life. He brought her coffee from the bar on Via Tornabuoni, exactly the way she liked it, which he had observed once, on the Sunday of the market, and had not forgotten, and set it on her drafting table in the morning without ceremony and without expectation of thanks. She learned to read him by learning to look for these things, the way you learn to read a facade by learning where the weight is held. He, in turn, was learning her. You do this thing, he said one evening. They were in his library, her with her books, him with his papers, a comfortable silence. When something in your work isn't right, you make a sound. I don't make a sound. You do. A very small sound. Like the beginning of a word that decides not to exist. He looked up. And then you put the pencil down and stare at the wall for approximately 2 minutes. And then you pick the pencil up and start again. She stared at him. You've been watching me work. I work in the same room as you. That's not. She paused. You make a sound too. No, you do. When you're reading something and it says what you expected, like you're confirming a thought, you exhale just slightly differently, like a very subtle. I don't. Luca. He looked at her for a moment, and that not-quite smile arrived and settled, and then, for the first time she had seen it do this, it became an actual smile, brief and private and completely unguarded. She thought, there it is. There is the thing behind the careful thing. She reached across the table and touched the back of his hand. Just her fingertips, brief. He turned his hand over and caught hers, and they held that for a moment. This small, exact thing. And then she went back to her books, and he went back to his papers, and the fire burned, and the city turned quietly outside. She had never, in her life, felt so precisely placed, as though all the geometry of her existence had been working toward this arrangement, this particular room, this particular fire, this particular man reading across the table. She did not tell him this. He would have found it exactly the right amount of true, and it would have landed in him the way things landed, deeply, permanently, without demonstration. She knew this because she was learning to read him. Elena Ferrante arrived on a Wednesday afternoon without warning, which was, Ella would come to understand, entirely characteristic of Elena Ferrante. She was 31, 3 years younger than Luca, and she shared his dark eyes and sharp jaw, but wore them differently. Where he was contained, she was kinetic. Where he was precise, she was prodigious. And where he projected stillness as a deliberate strategy, Elena's energy filled every room she entered, as though she had calculated the square footage and decided the entire space was hers by right. She came into the Palazzo library where Ella was working at the long table with her books and drawings spread around her, took in the scene with one comprehensive glance, the books, the drafting tools, the coffee cup, the woman, and said, in Italian-accented English, so you are the American. Ella looked up. And you are? Elena, his sister. She dropped her coat on the nearest chair, which happened to be one Luca used, without appearing to notice or care. He told me very little about you, which is how I knew it was serious. Is that the measure? Ella said. With Luca? Yes. When he is indifferent to something, he describes it at length. When it matters, he says almost nothing and his jaw gets tight. She sat down across from Ella with the ease of someone who had been entering this room since childhood. His jaw has been very tight for several months. Ella put down her pencil. She was trying to decide if she was intimidated, and she was, a little. Elena had the family quality of complete attention directed at full intensity. But there was something beneath the assessment, some quality that was curious rather than hostile, that made it possible to hold steady. Should I be worried about this conversation? She said. Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed. A proper laugh, sudden and unguarded. Nothing like Luca's fractional almost smiles. No, I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because he matters to me and I wanted to see for myself. She paused. Our mother is not well enough to travel. I came in her place, in a sense. How is your mother? Ella asked. Better than last autumn. Worse than 2 years ago. Elena said it with the practical clarity of someone who has been managing this knowledge for a long time and has built their life around rather than against it. She asks about you. He told her about me? He told her very little. She deduced the rest. She is, in her way, more frightening than both of us. Elena looked around the library, the books on their shelves, the fire laid but not yet lit, the long table with Ella's work spread across it. You work here. Most evenings. He lets you work in this room. Elena said it not as a question, but as a statement with a weight she was measuring. He has never let anyone work in this room. Not even me. And I grew up here. I didn't know that, Ella said. He wouldn't have told you. He doesn't explain his accommodations. He simply makes them. Elena looked at the books on the table. Architecture. Yes. I'm studying conservation, the preservation of historic buildings. In Florence, Elena said. You are studying how to keep old things from falling apart. She looked up. There is a metaphor there that I will not make. Out of courtesy. Ella smiled despite herself. I appreciate the restraint. They talked for an hour before Luca came home. About Elena's work, which was in fashion, in Milan, creating things that were decidedly not trying to last 500 years. About their mother, who had grown up in the Veneto and still spoke Venetian Italian in private moments. About the palazzo and its demands, the maintenance of old things. The negotiation between what a building wanted to be and what the people inside it needed it to do. Ella found herself talking about her project, about conservation philosophy, about the difference between preservation and ossification, and Elena listened with real interest, the same quality of attention she had in Luca, but turned up to a different register. When Luca arrived and found them together at the library table, his expression cycled through three things very quickly. Recognition, something that might have been alarm, and then a settling into careful neutrality. I see you've met, he said. She's been here for an hour, Ella said. I was in the neighborhood, Elena said, not remotely convincingly. He looked at his sister with the expression of a man who has known someone for 31 years and has made his peace with the ways they are inexplicable. Has she interrogated you? He said to Ella. We had a conversation, Ella said. She interrogated you. Only a little, Elena said. And I was very impressed. She did not find me intimidating. She's lying, Lucas said. Everyone finds you intimidating. I was a little intimidating, Ella admitted. Elena looked at her with something approaching delight. I like her, she said to Luca, in Italian, with the tone of someone delivering a verdict. She's honest. Lucas said something in Italian that Ella's language skills were not quite up to following. But its tone communicated both fond irritation and something else, something quieter, that made Elena's expression soften briefly into real affection. They had dinner together, the three of them. Elena, who talked about everything, Luca, who spoke rarely and precisely, and Ella in between, finding herself, with surprise and pleasure, at home in the dynamic. Elena left the next morning, pressing Ella's hands between hers in the vestibule and saying, You will come to Milan. I insist. I want to show you things that are new instead of old. I'd love that, Ella said, and meant it. After Elena's car had gone, Lucas stood in the courtyard and looked at the loggia, and Ella stood beside him. And after a moment he said, without turning, What did you talk about? For an hour. Architecture, Ella said. And your mother. And what it means to preserve old things. And me? She considered. She told me you have never let anyone work in this library. She seemed to think it was significant. He was quiet for a moment. It is significant, he said. I was not aware she knew. She grew up with you, Ella said. She knows everything. Yes, he agreed. Unfortunately. She bumped his shoulder with hers, lightly. He turned and looked at her, and that not-quite smile arrived, and this time stayed a little longer, settling into something that was almost, but not quite yet, the full thing. Come inside, he said. I'll light the fire. She went inside. He lit the fire. The library settled around them, warm and full of the specific silence of people who have found their frequency and can rest in it. The resolution with the Russo organization happened in December, quietly, the way things happened in Luca's world, with no visible dramatics, no scene that could be witnessed by anyone outside the rooms where it occurred. Luca told her only that the situation had been addressed, that the men who had frightened her had been instructed to leave Florence, and that Costa had returned to Naples with a message that had been received. He told her this over dinner, in the palazzo, matter-of-factly, as though reporting the weather. She sat with it for a moment. Are you safe? She said. He looked slightly surprised. Not greatly, because he was Luca, and greatly surprised was not in his register, but noticeably. Yes. Are you sure? As much as I can be. She looked at the table. What does that mean? As much as you can be. He set down his glass. It means that certainty in my world has a different coefficient than it does in most others. I cannot offer you perfect safety. For either of us. He looked at her. I can offer you the best of what I have, which is considerable. That's not. She stopped. I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm asking whether last week was particularly dangerous. Yes, he said. And this week? Less. Less, she repeated. She thought about this, turning it over. She thought about what she had come to understand about him. Not just the nature of his work, but the way he existed within it, the distinctions he made, the things he refused, the strange, absolute code that governed him beneath the governance of everything else. I need you to promise me something, she said. If I can, tell me when it's dangerous. I don't want to be protected in ignorance. I understand the impulse. I understand why you didn't tell me about the men following me. I understand it was to keep me calm, to keep me separate from it. She looked at him steadily. But I'm not the kind of person who functions better in ignorance. I function better knowing, even if the knowledge is frightening. He held her gaze for a long moment. You'll find it difficult, he said. Knowing. I know. Some of what I know would distress you. I know that too. And knowing that, you still prefer. Luca. She put her hand flat on the table, between them. I'm not fragile. I'm scared sometimes. I'm not always brave. I need. She paused, finding the word. I need you at my back. I need to know you're there. But I don't need to be kept in a glass case. I need to be in the room with you, in the actual room, even when the room is complicated. He looked at her hand on the table. He placed his over it. All right, he said. I'll tell you. She exhaled. It felt like something settling, not into comfort, but into the right configuration, the way a design settles when you've found the proportion that makes everything else work. Also, she said, I think you should meet Ji-Yun and Fiona. He looked up. My classmates, she said. The people I eat dinner with and study with and spend my time with. If you're going to be in my life, you should know the people in my life. He looked, for just a moment, slightly at sea. It was the expression of a man who had navigated enormously complex negotiations without flinching, confronted with the prospect of dinner with two architecture students. I can arrange that, he said, finally. You don't arrange it, she said, almost laughing. We go? We have dinner. You talk to people. Like a person. I am a person. I know. Act like one. He was quiet for a moment. And then, quietly, undeniably. As you wish. The dinner was Ella's idea and her production. She chose the trattoria near Santo Spirito where the owner's wife gave extra ribollita. She had explained this to Luca as a point of warmth, and he had received it with polite incomprehension, and invited Ji-Yun and Fiona with the vague explanation that there was a person she wanted them to meet. Ji-Yun arrived first, precise and dark-eyed, and already assessing Luca, before she sat down with the calm thoroughness of someone running a systems diagnostic. She shook his hand, said his surname back to him with a slight inflection that communicated she recognized it from somewhere, and sat. Fiona arrived 4 minutes late with her coat still half off and her opinion of something already in progress. She stopped when she saw Luca, looked at him, looked at Ella, and sat down with the expression of someone whose hypothesis had just been confirmed. Well, Fiona said. I understand things now. Do you? Ella said. A great many things. Fiona looked at Luca with cheerful directness. She's been vague about you for 2 months. Very unusual for Ella, who is normally precise to the point of tedium. Fiona, Ella said. I mean it warmly. Luca said, with perfect equanimity. I find precision is a reasonable response to uncertainty. Fiona considered this. I'll accept that. What do you do? I manage various interests. That's what people say when they're interesting, Ji-Yun said, quietly, from behind her menu. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Ella had not been sure what she had feared, embarrassment, perhaps, or the collision of worlds that had nothing in common. But what happened was something different. Luca was quiet in the way of someone who thinks carefully before speaking, and Fiona was the opposite. And Ji-Yun was the kind of listener who occasionally deployed a sentence that reoriented everyone. And Ella watched the three of them and felt something unclenching in her chest, some hell-breath thing she had not known she was holding. He did not try to be someone he wasn't. He didn't perform warmth or perform accessibility. He was exactly himself, which was contained and precise and capable of genuine interest in whatever was in front of him. And by the end of the second hour, Fiona was gesturing at him with her wine glass, while explaining her theory about why all the best architecture was argument made physical, and he was listening with complete attention and asking questions that proved he had actually heard every word. "I like him," Fiona announced, when Ella returned from the bathroom and found her classmates briefly alone. "He's strange, but he's real." "Strange, but real," Ji-yeon agreed, as though completing a verdict. Ella slid back into her seat. "Thank you both for your thorough evaluation." "Someone has to," Fiona said. "You're not objective." "No," Ella said. "I'm really not." She looked at Luca across the table, who was in conversation with Ji-yeon about some aspect of Korean contemporary architecture that Ji-yeon had introduced, and that he was following with his usual thorough attention, and she felt it again. That precisely placed feeling, that sense of the geometry being right. She was not objective. She was in it, whatever it was, completely. Her mother called on a Tuesday in January. Ella was in the library, the university's, this time, surrounded by architectural history, when her phone buzzed, and she saw her mother's name and stepped out into the cold corridor to answer. She was back in Florence from Christmas. She had gone home for 2 weeks, back to the Ohio town she had grown up in, her mother and the 2 cats in the house she had known since childhood. She had told her mother about Luca only in the most general outline. "A man I've become close to, Italian, someone who knows the city well." Her mother, who was practical and perceptive in the way of women who had raised a child alone, had asked questions that Ella had answered carefully, and had said, finally, "Does he make you feel safe?" "Yes," Ella had said, meaning it completely, understanding that safety was a complicated word in his context and meaning it anyway. Her mother had said, "Then that's what matters," and changed the subject to Orange, who had developed an opinion about the new brand of cat food. Now, in January, her mother was calling to tell her that her father who she had not seen since she was 11, who had left with an explanation she had never found satisfying and a forwarding address that had changed 3 times and then stopped, had died. In a hospital in Pennsylvania. A stroke. He had listed Ella as next of kin on his hospital paperwork, which was how they had known to call. She sat down on the cold corridor floor when her mother finished speaking. Her mother was still talking, asking if she was all right, and Ella said yes. Yes, she was fine. She would call back, and ended the call, and sat with her back against the wall and the cold of it seeping through her jacket. She had not spoken to her father in 12 years. She had stopped expecting to speak to him around the time she was 15, when she had done the math and understood that someone who chose not to be present did not want to be present, and the wanting of his presence on her part was a problem in her own arithmetic, not his. She had grieved him, the idea of him, the father-shaped absence, at 15, at 19, at various points. She had thought she was done with it. She was not, it turned out, done with it. She called Luca. She wasn't sure why. She hadn't planned to. Her hands decided before her mind did. He picked up on the second ring, said her name, and something in the way he said it, in the particular attention he always gave to things that mattered, undid her completely. She told him, not eloquently, in pieces, out of order, the way grief comes, not organized. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, the full attention, no gaps. When she finished, he said, "Where are you?" She told him. He was there in 12 minutes. He didn't say the things people say. He didn't offer comfort in the form of declarations. He sat beside her on the cold corridor floor without apparent concern for the dark suit or the dignity of the position, and he was simply present, the way he was always present, utterly, completely, without performance. She leaned against him. It was the first time she had let herself do this simple physical reliance, and he received it the way he received everything she gave him, without making a production of it, simply accepting its weight and holding it steady. "I didn't even like him," she said, into his shoulder. "I don't think I even knew him well enough to like or not like him. He was just absent. He was just an absence that was shaped like a person. Sometimes we grieve the absence," he said. "Not the person, the space they should have filled." She thought about this, about the father-shaped space in her life, and how she had built around it, the way a builder builds around a gap in the foundation, compensating, redistributing the load. Yes, she said. That grief is real, he said, even when its object is complicated. Were you close to your father? She asked. A long pause. No, he said. He was a man who believed that love was a form of weakness. He communicated this effectively. She understood, suddenly, with absolute clarity, why he had worked so hard to make himself unreadable. Why stillness was the first defense he had learned. Why the not-quite smile was something that arrived before his control could prevent it, because his control was very good, because it had been built against a father who had taught him that expression was dangerous. She reached up and found his hand. He held hers. They stayed on the corridor floor for a while, two people who had each been formed partly by an absence, learning the particular warmth of not being alone in it. February brought cold that had no intention of being charming, and Ella worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. The fellowship program's second semester project was ambitious. Each student was to develop a proposal for the adaptive reuse of a specific historic structure in Florence, moving through schematic design to design development over 12 weeks. Ella had chosen a disused early 20th century building near the station, once a commercial depot, now empty, and was wrestling with the problem of how to introduce contemporary spatial needs into a building whose structural logic was entirely of its moment. She worked in the Palazzo Library most evenings now. This had happened gradually, without being decided. She had worked there twice when she needed quiet, and then more frequently, and now it was simply where she went, her books and laptop and drafting tools arranged at one end of the long table, while Luca worked at his desk, each in their own concentration, the shared silence comfortable and specific, the particular intimacy of people who can work in each other's presence. He had learned not to interrupt her when she was in the state she called the zone and Fiona called the trance, when the forward lean happened and the pencil moved fast and the tongue was between the teeth. He knew to refill her coffee and leave it within reach without speaking, to redirect his phone calls to another room when they were long. These small calibrations he made without being asked, and she noticed each one and said nothing because some things were better received in silence than in acknowledgement. She did the same for him. She learned that he read his most difficult papers standing up, moving slowly around the room, and that when he needed to think through something complex, he stared at a particular spot on the wall to the left of the window, and that after a difficult day, which she could identify from a very slight tightness around his eyes and a certain quality of stillness that was more held than usual, the thing that helped was not conversation but presence, just being in the same room. One evening in February, he came in from a meeting and stood in the doorway of the library for a moment before coming in, and she looked at his face and understood that the day had been difficult in a way she might not want to know the details of. She looked at him. She did not ask. She simply got up, went to the kitchen, made 2 cups of tea. She had introduced tea to the palazzo, and it had been received with polite bewilderment by everyone except Luca, who had adapted to it with the thoroughness he brought to everything, and brought them back and set his beside him and sat in the chair by the fireplace with her own. He sat in the other chair. They were quiet for a long time. Eventually he said, "The situation in Genoa." "Yes," she said. "It was resolved badly." A pause. "My resolution, but badly. There will be consequences that I would have preferred to avoid." She held her tea. "Are you safe?" "Yes." Are the people around you safe?" "For now." He looked at the fire. "In my world, for now is the most available answer." "I know," she said. "I've come to understand that." He looked at her. In the firelight, she could see everything his face was doing. She had gotten better at this, at reading the subtle grammar of his expressions, the weight of the day, the thing he was carrying, and below both of those something else, something that was specifically about her presence in his chair in his library with her tea. "You make it better," he said. He said it quietly, with the particular care of someone making a statement that is larger than its words. She looked at him. "So do you," she said. He reached across and tucked a strand of hair that had escaped its pin behind her ear. It was the smallest gesture, and it landed in her the way the largest things had always landed in her. Completely, in the old sense of the word, filling the space it touched. She reached up and held his hand against her cheek for just a moment. Then they went back to their tea, and the fire, and the February city outside the tall windows. There were nights she could not sleep. Not from fear, or not only from fear, not anymore. The acute fear of those first months, the cold water shock of understanding exactly what world she had walked into, had transmuted into something more chronic and manageable, like a low-grade weather she had learned to dress for. She knew what he was. She knew the weight of it. She had decided, with as much clarity as she could bring to the decision, that she was staying, and the decision did not require revisiting. But there were nights when the weight settled differently. When she lay in the dark and thought about the life she was building, the one that required her to understand that, for now, was the standard coefficient of safety, that some of the conversations she would never be told about were conversations that mattered immensely, that the men who watched her building had been put there by the same man who corrected her coffee order and lit the fire in the library and said come home like it was the simplest fact in the world. On one of those nights, in March, she got up at 2 in the morning and went to the library and sat in the dark for a while. And Luca found her there 20 minutes later. He had heard her, or perhaps he had simply known, the way he often seemed to know, and sat in the other chair without turning on the light. They sat in the dark for a while. The fire was long out. There was only the ambient light of the city coming through the tall windows, dim and orange. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about the future," she said. "About what it looks like. And I couldn't make the drawing come right," she said. "In my head. It kept. There were parts one couldn't see clearly." She paused. "I kept getting stuck on the same question. Which is," she thought about how to say it. She had been a student long enough to know that the way you frame a question determines what kinds of answers are available. "The question is whether I can build a life that is full," she said slowly. "Whether I can have work that matters and people I love and a place that is mine, inside your world. Not adjacent to it. Inside it. And why can't you see it clearly?" he said. He was not deflecting. She had learned the difference between his deflections, which were very subtle and precise, and his genuine questions. "Because the parts one can see are very beautiful," she said. "And beauty in architecture sometimes means you're not looking hard enough at the structure." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she wondered if she had said something that required a different kind of processing than she understood. "Then, I grew up in this world. I have been in it my entire life. I have watched it take things from people. Time, peace, the ordinary freedoms that other people take completely for granted." He paused. "My mother used to sit at that window." He indicated the window that looked out over the street. "On evenings when my father was late returning, and the particular quality of her stillness in those moments is something I have carried for 20 years. Ella said nothing. She waited. "I have told myself," he continued, "that I have made this different. That the organization under my management is governed by a different logic than it was under his. That the damage is more contained, the exposure more calculated, the people around me more protected." A pause. "All of this is true. None of it makes the coefficient of risk 0. "I know," she said. "I cannot promise you ordinary freedoms," he said. "I cannot promise you the life your classmates will have, the simple, unmarked life of a person who has never touched this world." He looked at her in the dark. "I can promise you that everything I am and everything I can do will be directed toward keeping you as safe as it is possible to be. I can promise you that you will never be managed or hidden or diminished. I can promise you that the parts of this world I am able to shield you from, I will shield you from, and the parts one cannot, I will explain." He paused. "And I can promise you that the thing we are building, this specific thing between us, is the most important structure I have ever tried to build. And I build carefully." She breathed, in and out. The city breathed with her, its low orange ambient light constant and patient. "I know all of that," she said finally. "I think I just needed to hear it in the dark. Then I'll say it in the dark as often as necessary." She got up and crossed the room to his chair and curled into it beside him, the chair that was just barely wide enough for two people who were willing to be close. He put his arm around her. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "The drawing will come right," she said. I just had to stop trying to force the lines. The best structures resist forcing, he said. I know. She closed her eyes. I know. They stayed there until the city began to lighten, and then she slept, properly, in the chair in the dark library with his arm around her, and the old stones of the palazzo, holding them with the patient, enormous permanence of things built to last. She called her mother in March, on a Sunday evening, the city outside Luca's window already beginning to smell of spring, that soft, wet green smell that Ella associated now with possibility. And her mother said, within 2 minutes of their call beginning, "You're in love with him." "Mom, I can hear it," her mother said. "You sound like you're standing on solid ground. You've always sounded a little like you were managing your footing, even when things were fine. Now you sound settled." Ella looked out the window at the terracotta rooftops, at the dome of the cathedral just visible in the distance, at the city that had been standing for so long it had forgotten the names of most of the people who had loved it. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Then, is he good to you? And I mean, is he actually good to you, in the day-to-day? Because the dramatic stuff, the big gestures, those are easy. The day-to-day is where character shows." Ella thought about coffee appearing at her drafting table, about being walked home in the dark without being made to feel incapable, about her name in his voice on the phone when she'd called from outside her father's life, needing something she couldn't name, about the truth he'd told her when he could have told her a comfortable lie, about all the small, specific, daily calibrations he made, not to manage her, but to see her, actually see what she needed, and provide it without ceremony. "Yes," she said. "He is." "Then I want to meet him eventually," her mother said. "And I want you to be careful. And I want you to be happy." A pause. "In that order?" Ella laughed. "Mom, I'm serious about the order. Careful first." "I know." She paused. "He keeps me careful, actually. He's very clear-eyed about risk. He tells me when things are serious." Her mother made a sound that communicated she was processing this and had more to say on the subject at a later date. Then she asked about the depot project, and Ella told her about the structural problem she was working through, the question of how to express the contemporary intervention without erasing the original building's logic. And her mother listened with the loving incomprehension of someone who was proud of a child who had gone somewhere she could not follow. When she hung up, Luca was in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. "Your mother," he said. "She says you should know she wants to meet you eventually, and that careful comes before happy." Something moved in his face. Not the not-quite smile. Something fuller, warmer, more private. "She sounds sensible." "She's the most sensible person I know." Ella looked at him. "She also says I sound settled. Like I'm standing on solid ground." He crossed the room and stood in front of her and looked at her with that expression she had learned to read, the one that was all of him, unguarded and complete, the thing behind the careful thing. "Good," he said, quietly. She stood up. She was close to him now, close enough to see the specific warmth of his dark eyes, the architecture of his face in the afternoon light, all the things she had learned to read and still found inexhaustible. She kissed him, softly, for a long moment. When she pulled back, his expression was still open. It closed slowly, like a door that is carefully shut rather than slammed, something protected and particular settling behind his eyes. He rested his forehead against hers. "Ella," he said. "Her name. Just her name." "I know," she said. She did know. She knew everything it meant, all the weight of it, all the complexity. She accepted all of it. "I know." Spring in Florence was the city at its most impossibly beautiful. The wisteria that climbed the back wall of the palazzo bloomed purple in April, cascading over the old stone, and the air had that particular quality of warm afternoons and cool evenings that made everything feel both temporary and eternal. Ella was aware, in April, that she had 6 months left. The fellowship was 12 months. She had arrived in August. She would leave in August, return to Ohio, to her mother and the cats, and the career she was building. She had applications out to 3 architecture firms that offered graduate positions, had a preliminary conversation with a professor at Ohio State about PhD programs, had a life with a shape and a trajectory that had existed before Florence and would have to be dealt with after it. She had not talked to Luca about this. She was not sure why. She told herself it was too early, that 6 months was far away, that the conversation would happen when it needed to happen. She told herself many things. She sketched in the Boboli Gardens on a warm April afternoon, sitting on the low wall near the isolato while the fountain played and the cypresses stood in their precise dark rows, and she thought about permanence. About the difference between structures built to last and structures built for a moment. About what it meant to invest fully in a thing whose duration was unknown. She thought, architecture is always a bet on the future. You build for circumstances you can only partly predict. The good buildings, the ones that survived 500 years, had survived because they had been built with enough internal logic that they could adapt, could absorb the pressure of changing times without losing what they essentially were. She thought, that is the question. Whether this, whatever this is, has that internal logic. Whether it is built to last. Luca found her there at 6 o'clock, which she had stopped questioning. He always seemed to know where she was, not in a surveilling way, but in the way of someone who paid attention to patterns. He sat beside her on the wall and looked at the fountain. 6 months, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I know. I haven't wanted to talk about it. No. She looked at the fountain. I have applications out. In Ohio. There's a firm in Columbus that I'm very excited about. They do this extraordinary adaptive reuse work, old industrial buildings. They're doing important things. Tell me about them, he said. She looked at him. Luca, tell me about the firm, he said. I want to understand what you're building toward. She told him. She talked about the firm's work, the projects she had studied, the kind of practice she wanted to develop, the particular intersection of conservation and contemporary design that was becoming her focus, the way the Depot project had crystallized something in her understanding of what she wanted to do with her work. He listened with his full attention, asking questions, following the threads. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. It sounds important, he said. It is. She paused. To me, it is. Then it matters. She looked at him. That's not enough of a conversation. No, he agreed. But I needed to understand what you want before I said anything about what I want. He looked at the fountain. I'm not a man who has had much practice in thinking about the future in terms other than risk and strategy. What I want has not always been a variable I gave weight to. And now, he turned to look at her. In the April light, with the wisteria and the cypresses and the fountain and the ancient city around them, his face was entirely open, the way it was sometimes in the library by the fire, when the guard was down and the thing itself was simply there. I want you, he said, to be in your life, not to impose on it. I understand what you've built and what you're building, and it is worth building. But I want, he paused, I want to figure out how the geometry works. Whether there is a geometry that works. She felt something she did not have an architectural analogy for. Something that was simply itself, relief and terror and joy, in a compound that had no single word. There are firms in Italy, she said. Milan. Rome. There are. I haven't looked, but there are. You should look, he said. If you want to look. I want to look, she said. I also want to go home. I miss Ohio. I miss my mother. I miss the cats. She paused. I also don't want to leave this. I don't want to leave you. Florence will still exist, he said. I will still exist. Geography is a problem of logistics. You make it sound simple. It isn't simple, he said. Nothing about this is simple. But I've spent my life solving complicated problems, and I find that the ones worth solving don't frighten me. He looked at her. This doesn't frighten me. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had been built for stillness and had, slowly, over months, allowed her into the parts of himself that were not still. At the man who had walked her home in the dark and told her the truth, and made her coffee, and sat on a cold corridor floor without concern for his suit. Tell me the logistics, she said. I can travel, he said. I have interests in New York that require periodic attention, and Ohio is not far. You can spend summers here, if you choose. We find what works. He paused. Or, there are firms in Florence. Good ones. I know the director of the Soprintendenza. There is also the question of whether your fellowship might be extended. I hadn't considered an extension, she said. Would you consider it? She thought about it. About the depot project, about the building she was coming to understand, about the language of Florence that she was still learning and might spend a lifetime learning. About the library in the palazzo and the Sunday markets and Professor Cassini saying listen to Stone. Yes, she said. I would consider it. He took her hand. They sat with the fountain playing in front of them and the evening settling over the city, and they did not solve anything that afternoon. The logistics remained entirely unresolved, the future an open question, but they had agreed that the future was something to move toward together rather than apart, and that agreement, Ella thought, was the foundation. Everything else you built on top of it. The depot project presentation was in June. Ella had been working on it for 3 months. A 1920s commercial depot near the Santa Maria Novella station, which she proposed to convert into a center for architectural education and community programming, maintaining the building's structural logic while inserting a new interior landscape that played against rather than erasing the industrial past. The presentation was before a panel that included Professor Cassini, 2 visiting critics from Rome, and 3 Florentine architects, one of whom, Ella discovered 2 days before, was someone Luca knew. Should I be worried? She asked. About Archetti? No. He's rigorous, but fair. A pause. He'll focus on your structural argument. The structural argument is the strongest part, she said. Then you'll be fine. She was not fine in the days leading up to it. She was a knot of anxiety, not the paralyzing kind, but the productive kind, the kind that made her work 18-hour days and revise her drawings to the point where Ji-yun told her that if she changed the presentation of the roof terrace one more time, she was going to steal the drawings and hide them. She woke at 3 in the morning with specific anxieties about the relationship between her proposed mezzanine structure and the existing column grid, got up, went to the desk, resolved them, went back to sleep. Luca was there through all of it. He did not tell her everything would be fine, because he was not a man who made empty reassurances. He made sure she ate. He drove her to the scuola on the days she was working late. He sat in the library while she revised and gave his opinion when she asked, with the directness she had come to rely on, not encouraging for its own sake, but genuinely engaging with what she showed him, the way he engaged with everything. The mezzanine interrupts the reading of the industrial column sequence, he said one evening, looking at the section drawing she'd pinned to the board. I know. That's intentional. It creates a counterpoint. Does it create dialogue or noise? She looked at the drawing for a long moment. That's the question, she said. She revised the mezzanine. The revision made it stronger. The morning of the presentation, she was up at 5, showered, dressed in the one good blazer she had brought to Florence and had worn 3 times, and was eating toast in the kitchen when he appeared in the doorway. He had started, over the winter, staying at the palazzo most nights, a development that had been gradual and had been discussed briefly and practically and had settled into simple rightness. In his shirt, no jacket, with coffee. He set the coffee down in front of her. He sat across the table. You are prepared, he said. I know. You've resolved the mezzanine question. Yes. Your structural argument is sound and your design reasoning is clear. I know. He looked at her. What is the fear, then? She thought about it. That I've gotten something wrong that I can't see. That there's a flaw I'm blind to. That is always possible, he said. It is also possible that there is not. One of these is more likely, given the evidence. You're very logical. In matters of risk assessment, yes. She smiled despite herself. All right. Thank you. Go build something, he said. Simply, as though it were the most natural instruction in the world. She went. She presented. The panel was thorough and sometimes sharp, and Archetti, the Florentine architect Luca knew, asked 3 consecutive questions about the mezzanine that were precisely the right questions, and she answered them precisely, with the confidence of someone who has resolved the problem and knows how they resolved it and why. Professor Cassini, at the end, said, Miss Donovan has done something difficult and done it well. She has learned to listen. She called Luca from the steps of the scuola. her voice slightly unsteady with something she was identifying as relief crossed with joy. "Well," he said. "Good," she said. It was good. She could hear, in the silence before he responded, the thing that he was containing. The satisfaction, the specifically personal satisfaction of someone for whom this result mattered because she mattered. He would not say this. She heard it anyway. "Come home," he said. She went home. The conservation project she was assigned in her second semester was a small oratory on the eastern edge of the Altrarno. One of those buildings that Florence kept like a secret, invisible from the main streets, accessible through an arch that most people walked past without a second glance. Inside, a single space, roughly 12 by 8 meters, with a barrel-vaulted ceiling that had been painted, probably in the late 15th century, with a scattered pattern of stars on a deep blue ground, most of which were either flaking or had simply been lost to time. The walls retained traces of a narrative fresco cycle. Saints, probably, though the faces were so deteriorated that individual identity was impossible to establish without documentary research. She spent the first 2 weeks simply looking. This was, she had learned, the essential first discipline of conservation work. You did not do anything to a structure until you understood what the structure was doing. Every crack, every loss, every discoloration, every place where plaster had been reapplied over earlier plaster, every ghost of a form visible beneath a later overpaint. All of it was information, the building's own record of what it had been through, the autobiography written in damage. She went in the mornings, before anyone else arrived, and sat in the empty oratory with her notebook and her flashlight and her patience, and she looked at the ceiling, at the scattered stars on their deep blue ground, at the way the light fell through the single window above the altar and traveled across the vault during the hour she sat there, revealing different things at different angles. She was there one morning in April when her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it and saw a message from Luca. "Something I want to show you tonight. After 7. She typed back, "Where?" "Here." "The palazzo, then." She went back to looking at the ceiling. That evening, he took her through the palazzo to rooms she had not been in. Not the library, not the piano nobile rooms she knew, but up a further stair to the top floor, where the ceilings were lower and the windows looked out over a different angle of the city, and everything smelled very slightly of the accumulated time of the building. That particular dry stone and old wood smell she associated now with the specific quality of beautiful old things. He opened a door onto a room that had been, she thought, originally a loggia, a covered terrace, later enclosed. The ceiling was low and barrel-vaulted and painted, and when he turned on the lights, she caught her breath. It was a ceiling fresco, small scale. The room was not large, but extraordinary in its state of preservation, a scene that she identified, after a moment, as architectural in subject, figures arranged around what appeared to be the construction of a building, men on scaffolding, a figure in the foreground with plans, another gesturing upward at a rising structure. The colors were remarkable, deep ochre, terra verde, ultramarine, and the painting had been done with a precision that suggested the painter had been as interested in the architecture as in the figures. "When was this painted?" she said. "Approximately 1530. The patron was an ancestor who had been, among other things, involved in a significant building campaign on the property." He looked at the ceiling. "We have documentary records that mention a painter being commissioned for the private rooms. We don't have his name." "He was good," she said. She was looking at the architectural detail in the fresco, the depiction of the unfinished structure, the way the painter had understood and rendered the geometry of construction, the scaffolding rendered with real knowledge of how scaffolding worked. "I thought you would want to see it," he said. Simply. She turned and looked at him. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, watching her look at the ceiling, with the expression she had learned to read as his version of pleasure, not demonstrative, not performed, just the genuine satisfaction of someone who has given a thing that was the right thing to give. "How long have you known about this room?" she said. "My whole life. You've been waiting for the right moment to show me." He considered this. "I've been waiting for a reason to care about showing someone," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the ceiling, pulling out her phone to photograph the details, the painted scaffolding, and the anonymous painter's careful depiction of rising stone. "I want to write about this," she said, "if you'd allow it, for my documentation work. The iconography alone." "It's yours," he said. "Write what you like." She documented the room for an hour, moving around it with her phone and her notebook, and he leaned against the doorframe and watched her work with the patience of someone who has nowhere else he would rather be. And the anonymous painter's ceiling blazed quietly above them both. 500 years of good work holding itself intact, waiting for someone who would understand what it had been doing. Walking back down through the palazzo, she took his hand. He held it the way he held everything that mattered, firmly, without drama, as a simple fact. "Thank you," she said. "It's been waiting," he said, "for the right set of eyes." She thought about that on the walk back through the palazzo's dark corridors, the centuries of stone around them. About what it meant that a painting had been here for 500 years, unseen except by those who lived in this building, and that someone had finally arrived who could read its grammar, understand its decisions, speak its language. About finding the thing that was waiting for you to arrive. About arriving in time. The summer was long and golden and full of the specific richness of a life that has found its shape. Ella's mother came in July. She stayed for 10 days, in a small hotel on the Altrarno that Ella had specifically chosen for its proximity to things she knew her mother would love, and Luca met her on the second day, at a dinner in the courtyard of the palazzo. Ella watched her mother walk into the courtyard and stop and look up at the loggia, at the Pietra Serena columns, and the Florentine lilies in the capitals, and say, "Oh my. It's extraordinary, isn't it?" Ella said, standing beside her. She had stopped, long ago, being able to see it the way she had on that first visit with her classmates. She knew it too well now, knew every stone in proportion. But she could see it through her mother's eyes, and it was, still, extraordinary. Luca met her mother the way he met everyone, with complete attention and no performance. He listened to her talk about Orange and Professor and the garden and the Ohio town, and he asked real questions, and her mother, who was, as Ella had said, the most sensible person she knew, looked at him with the clear assessment of someone who has spent 23 years protecting a person they love and is trying to determine whether the person in front of her is worth trusting. By the end of the evening, Ella's mother said quietly, in the private moment before the car came, "He loves you very much." "Did he say something?" "He doesn't say," her mother said. "That's actually how I know." She squeezed Ella's hand. "The ones who say easily don't always mean it. The ones who show, those ones mean it." Ella thought about coffee on the drafting table, about the corridor floor and the cold of the stone and the weight she had leaned into him. About "come home," said simply, meaning everything. "Yes," she said. "I think he does." Her fellowship was extended. She had applied in May with Cassini's support, and the Scuola's director had offered a second-year fellowship focused on conservation practice, a more specialized track, more closely aligned with the work she wanted to do. She had spent 3 weeks in careful conversation with her Ohio prospects, turning down the Columbus firm's offer with honest regret and gratitude, deciding to defer the PhD programs for a year. She called each person and told them directly. She hated disappointing people, always had. It was one of the ways her softness showed, the difficulty of causing disappointment, but she did it clearly, with explanation, and they were gracious. She told Luca over dinner in the courtyard, on a warm July night, that she was staying. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The second-year program, the conservation track, is what you want." "Yes. It's exactly where my work is going." "Not because of the work," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not staying for you. I'm staying for the work and also you. The staying has 2 reasons, not 1. He looked at her. "Good," he said. "That's how it should be. You're not going to be sentimental about this at all, are you?" "I'm very sentimental about it," he said. "I'm choosing not to demonstrate it in ways that could embarrass us both." She laughed. "Luca, yes. I love you." He looked at her, and the thing behind the careful thing was entirely visible. All of it, unguarded and complete, an enormous in the quiet, certain way of very large things that have been true for a very long time and have simply been waiting to be named. I know, he said, and then, as though the words had made their decision independently of him, as though they had simply arrived and he was only their vehicle. I love you. She reached across the dinner table and took his hand. The courtyard was warm around them, the Pietra Serena glowing in the candlelight, the Florentine lilies in the capitals casting small shadows above, the building that had been standing since 1587 holding them in its patient, ancient geometry. She thought about what Brunelleschi had known, that a structure with the right internal logic holds itself up, that the dome rises not because of external support, but because of the decisions baked into every course of brick, every calculated angle, every herringbone pattern that distributes the weight and makes the thing inevitable. She thought, this is what that feels like. From the inside, August returned, as it always does, generous and relentless, piling heat onto the stones that had been absorbing heat for centuries. The tourists arrived with their rolling luggage and their selfie sticks and their expressions of careful wonder, standing in front of the baptistry, in front of the Ponte Vecchio, in front of the Duomo, trying to take in something that resisted easy comprehension. Ella watched them from the steps of the scuola and felt a complicated affection that she recognized, now, as the affection of someone who has crossed from visitor to inhabitant, who has put down enough roots that the ground has started to remember her weight. She had arrived with the summer a year ago, with her 2 duffel bags and her portfolio case and her map folded inside out, and had not known what she was arriving toward. She had known about the fellowship, about the program, about the city in the general way of someone who has read about a thing and is prepared to be surprised by the difference between reading and being there. She had not known about the woman she would become in the learning, the accumulated weight of a year of listening to Stone. She had not known about any of it. She thought, sometimes, about the version of herself who had stepped off that train. The girl who had bought rosemary she didn't mean to buy, and carried it home thinking about the smell of something she wanted to remember. She was fond of her. She hoped that girl had had no idea what was coming, because the not knowing had been important. The willingness to walk into the September streets alone, to be in the middle of things before she knew what the things were. You couldn't design your way into certain kinds of experience. You had to arrive without a plan. Ella watched them from the steps of the scuola, where she was eating lunch in the shade, and felt a complicated affection. She had been one of them, a year ago, more or less. She had arrived with her maps and her portfolio case and her functional Italian and her determination to listen to Stone, and the Stone had told her things she had not expected. She was in her 2nd fellowship year now. Her conservation work had focused, over the spring, on a late Renaissance chapel that was undergoing stabilization. She had been involved in the documentation process and had spent 3 months learning, in fine-grained detail, what it meant to preserve something that did not want to be preserved, that was crumbling at its own speed and did not particularly care about human intervention. It had been humbling and wonderful. She was also, provisionally, in conversation with a Florentine firm, small, serious, the kind of practice that did the work she wanted to do, about a junior position beginning the following September. It was not certain. Nothing was. But it was a possible shape for the future, and she had learned, in this city, that possible shapes were what you worked with. Fiona had left Florence in June, back to Edinburgh and the firm she had apprenticed with before the fellowship. They kept in vigorous contact. Fiona had opinions about everything, always, and shared them freely across time zones. Gian had stayed, accepted to a doctorate program, was living 2 streets over, and came for dinner twice a week. The rest of the fellowship cohort had scattered. Tobias was back in Munich, sending occasional precise emails about his projects. Raphael had opened a small studio in Sao Paulo. The Egyptian woman, Amira, was working in Dubai, building things that looked like the future. Ella had sketched everyone's faces in the last week before they scattered. She had given them each a portrait, pencil on the good paper she saved for things that mattered. None of them had expected it. All of them had been, in their various ways, undone by it. She put the last of her lunch away and picked up her sketchbook. Across the piazza, the evening was beginning to settle in, the long golden light of August spreading across the facades, turning everything it touched into something that felt like memory. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Asterisk, I'll be finished by 7. The wisteria is still out. Come through the courtyard tonight. Asterisk. She typed back. I'll bring dinner. A pause. Then, Marco will be offended. She smiled. Tell Marco I'll bring enough for him too. She put the phone away and looked at the city around her, the old stones and the evening light and the particular way Florence held itself. This city that had survived floods and wars, and the Black Death and the Nazis and 5 centuries of tourists, and its own complicated relationship with its own beauty. It was still here. It was still itself. It had built something in itself that held. She thought about her mother's question. Does he make you feel safe? Yes. Not in the simple sense. She had long since understood that safety, in the conventional sense, was relative in his world. That it required active maintenance. That there were days and situations and conversations that were complicated and frightening, and that she had learned to sit with rather than flee from. She was not pretending otherwise. But yes, he made her feel safe in the way that mattered most. In herself. In her own capacity to stand in the world. He had never treated her as though she needed to be managed, even when he managed things around her. He had never made her feel small for being frightened, or weak for needing comfort, or foolish for caring about things that had nothing to do with survival. He had simply been there, steady in the way of old structures, the ones that have found their own equilibrium and hold it without effort. She opened her sketchbook to a clean page. She drew the facade across the piazza, the pilasters, the proportion of windows to wall, the entablature, with the fast, confident lines of someone who has been doing this long enough that the hand knows what the eye knows. At the bottom of the drawing she wrote, in small letters, asterisk Florence. August. Everything is being built, asterisk. She meant the chapel, the possibly future firm, the career she was constructing from the foundation up. She also meant something else. Something less architectural and more essential. The city held its breath. The evening fell. Ella Donovan picked up her sketchbook and her bag and her groceries and walked home through the streets she knew by heart now. Through the Altrarno she had made her own, across the bridge over the Arno that she had drawn many times in many lights, to the door on Via dei Serragli, and then, because the evening was warm and she had an invitation and there was wisteria in the courtyard, through the other door on Via Tornabuoni, through the vestibule, into the courtyard where the fountain stood, and the loggia curved, and the Florentine lilies watched from the capitals as they had watched for 500 years. Luca was already there, standing in the courtyard in the last of the light, looking up at something on the second loggia she couldn't immediately see. He turned when he heard her. The look on his face, when he saw her, she had learned to read it. She had the whole grammar of him now, could parse the precise meaning of every inflection. This one, the one he wore when she arrived. She had no architectural analogy for it. It was simply itself, complete. The wisteria is out, she said. As promised. He crossed to her and took the grocery bag from her arm without asking. What did you bring? Ribollita from the trattoria. And bread. She paused. And the good olive oil. Marco will be pleased. I told you he would be pleased. They walked across the courtyard together, her shoulder at his arm, his hand at the small of her back. That instinctive, protective gesture she had stopped noticing as deliberate because it had become simply the geography of being beside him. The stones under their feet were 500 years old. The evening was new. She thought about what Professor Cassini had told them on the first morning, in the room that looked out over terracotta rooftops toward the Duomo. Asterisk, everything you see here has been built, torn down, rebuilt, argued over, and survived. Every stone has a lesson. Your job is to learn to listen to stone, asterisk. She was listening. She thought the stone was saying, asterisk this. This is the thing that holds, asterisk. The door opened. The light from inside fell across the courtyard, warm and specific. Luca held the door. She went in. Above them, the wisteria moved in the evening air, purple and patient, and alive.